All right, good morning, class. This is John checking in. We're going to make some more comments to take us further through World War One. As you probably noticed, our textbook makes pretty short shrift or short treatment of World War One because it happens in the context of Chapter 19, where it's really trying to cover all the events leading up to World War Two. So anyway, in some ways this is nice. I mean, the drawback is that we miss out on a lot of the fascinating sort of side stories that happened as part of World War One. Things like, chemical warfare, trench warfare, the challenges of trying to maintain sanitation and antiseptic conditions in the context of a war that's being fought around mud and rats. Fascinating stories of the Europeans relying upon non-European soldiers to do the fighting of essentially a European battle. Nonetheless, we're going to move through this rather quickly, and there is something that's sort of nice about that. I mean, we are going to talk about the causes of the war and then also the consequences, but we'll be sidestepping much of what happens in between. So my apologies in advance if there are some of you who are real war buffs and you feel like your inner war buff is not being completely satisfied. So anyway, sorry. We'll move through here. I've already shown these storylines and objectives. If you need to pause, you can. Talked about sort of the larger um, context of the war. And then I used the metaphor of World War One being something of a fire that consists of different fuels, those fuels that were deep and underlying, those fuels that were a little closer to the surface in terms of causing the conflicts between these European countries. And then finally, the match that ignited the logs and kindling that had already been put in place based on other differences that existed between European powers at that time. And here we have, in some ways, the center of the show, the center of the controversy. We talked about how one of the logs in the previous slide was the fact that there was an ongoing rivalry caused in part by the weakening of the Ottoman Empire. And as the Ottomans withdrew from southeastern Europe, they created something of a vacuum. And in the decades leading up to World War I, there had been a number of small differences and conflicts between the Russians and the Austro-Hungarians, to a lesser extent the Ottomans themselves, in how they vied for this region of southeastern Europe. We oftentimes hear this region referred to as the Balkans. The Balkans were a uniquely unstable place. In some ways, they remain somewhat unstable even to this day. At least events into the 1990s would indicate as much. But here we have Gabriel Principe, who is the gentleman who has the infamy, or he's sort of ignominious for having assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Eastern Europe at this time is still sort of under the long-lasting Habsburg Empire. The Austro-Hungarians were a power in Europe at this time, but they were starting to lose their power. They were, unfortunate for them, they weren't really a true nation state. Their state consisted of a lot of different ethnically diverse people. And this created some problems for them as they tried to hold on to their long-standing claim to power. The Austro-Hungarians wanted to rebuild their power and reestablish their power in part by claiming lands that the Ottoman Turks had been abandoning. Of course, their neighbors to the east, and by that I mean the Austro-Hungarians' neighbors to the east, Russia, were also interested in occupying the vacuum created by the departure of the Ottomans. So then there's this little country, Serbia, which has actually quite a bit in common with Russia. The people of Serbia are Slavic. They speak a similar language. They share a similar history and custom with their neighbor to the east. They don't share a whole lot in common with the Austro-Hungarians. So the Serbians had hoped that they could establish their independence. They were looking to their sort of big brother and supporter, Russia, to help them do that. Austro-Hungarian, by contrast, had been inching ever more into the vacuum created by the departure of the Ottomans, and this made a lot of Serbian people angry. So there was this group called the Black Hand Organization. It was like a secret terrorist organization that was trying to bring about and undermine the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And one of the ways they did this was by putting in place assassination plans for when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was venturing into an area of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that the Serbian Black Hand organization wanted to claim for the purposes of growing the small country of Serbia. Okay, so there you have it. Gavrilo Princip was actually part of a larger conspiracy, consisted of 3 or 4 men, all of whom were dying of some disease. For the most part, it was tuberculosis. As you can see in this picture here, Gavrilo Princip does not look well, and he is actually in the process of slowly dying from tuberculosis. So part of the idea was that choosing someone who was not exactly healthy and vibrant would make it easier to put together a plan such as this assassination campaign. Well, although there was some stumbling and bumbling, the assassination effort conspiracy is going to ultimately prove successful. And so by summer of 1914, not only is the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire dead, but it was carried out by a neighbor, rival, Serbian organization, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire is going to look for justice and figure out what's going on. And that's where things get quite interesting. So if we look at this map, this is a map of Europe on the eve of World War II. I can't be certain that my clicker here, that this pointer is working, but I'm going to try anyway. So if you're not seeing anything on the screen, don't be too concerned. Actually, you know what I'll do? Instead, I'll use I'm going to use the mouse because this will do a better job. So we know that there are alliances that exist in Europe on the eve of World War I, and they follow along this central corridor of the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Initially, it's going to include Italy, although Italy will change sides midway through World War I, and then it'll also extend down to the Ottoman Empire. Now, this map sort of helps tell the story. Here we have the small country of Serbia. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had been encroaching and moving its claims farther southeast into what the Serbians hoped would become a greater Serbia or a larger Serbia. The Serbians wanted to increase their footprint, but that was of course going to be difficult to do when the Austro-Hungarians were moving down. So Serbia undertook this, and it wasn't all Serbians who were a part of it, but the Serbian government, we do think, had a role to play in this, but they undertook this conspiracy which resulted in the death in Sarajevo, about here, of the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Now, Russia has an affinity for the Serbians because I said they share a lot of things in common. So what winds up happening is the Austro-Hungarian Empire comes to Serbia looking for justice. It gives them a number of impossible circumstances that the Austro-Hungarians expect of the Serbians in order to restore peace and justice. The Russians sort of quietly assure the Serbians that they won't allow anything to happen to them, so they should proceed without any concerns. We also know that Russia has an spoken alliance with the British and the French over here. So you're starting to probably see how this goes. Germany is a supporter of the Austro-Hungarians. The Germans give the Austro-Hungarians a blank check to, a blank check of support, unconditional support, if they choose to ratchet up their frustrations with the Serbians. So this map sort of shows you how an isolated instance between the Austro-Hungarians here and the Serbians here quickly engulfs a number of European countries. Now, to make matters more interestingly, the Germans had been preparing militarily for some sort of invasion by their neighbors on the European continent. They'd been doing this for probably over a decade. It was known as the Schlieffen Plan, which I have up here. And the Schlieffen Plan was based on a German expectation that they had to worry about getting into a two-front war. So the German military decided, well, Russia is a big, sluggish, sort of outdated country. We don't have that much to worry about from her, and if we do have anything to worry about from her, it's going to come slowly. So the idea that the Germans came up with in the Schlieffen Plan was that if any difficulty, any unrest broke out on the European continent, Germany would strike first west, strike the French, knock them out in a way that would then allow them to focus all of their resources on their eastern border with Russia. So when the Austro-Hungarians and Serbians are getting into it, Germany is preparing its Schlieffen Plan to bolt quickly west and then focus east. And the story of World War I is in many respects a story of the failure of the Schlieffen Plan, because the Germans wanted a quick knockout blow in the west, and instead what they got was only a partially successful blow that settles down into trench warfare. It brings the British into the conflict with the French, and it creates Germany's worst nightmare, which was having a prolonged conflict on both its western border and its eastern border. So the Schlieffen Plan is a failure, but it helps explain how World War I breaks out in the specific way that it does. Here you can pause and study this map. It's also in your textbook, but this shows you the global implications of World War I. Okay, so the other important part of the story are, how does World War I blow up and turn into a larger conflict? Well, the Russians, as we mentioned, out of support for Serbia, are going to enter into the conflict and support their smaller neighbor country, the Serbians. And the Russians actually surprise the Germans by how quickly they are able to mobilize their million soldiers or so. But things don't go very well for Russia in the early years of World War I. She loses a tremendous number of soldiers, and the Russian people start to lose their support for their Tsar, Nicholas, midway through the conflict. And none of this bodes well for Russia. In fact, by 1917, Russia is going to undergo a domestic revolution. This is where Vladimir Lenin helps lead a successful Bolshevik revolution, which brings about a communist era in Russia, and Russia will in fact now become the Soviet Union. So the Russian Revolution is a tremendous blow to the hopes of the Triple Entente, or the Allied powers. Remember, Great Britain, France, and Russia? Because suddenly they've lost a major partner and player in World War I. Well, fortunately for them, the United States is going to be moved to the front porch and to entry into World War I. And briefly, the two events that are really instrumental here are the sinking of the Lusitania, which happened in 1915. This was a mostly passenger boat liner, although we do know that it was carrying some military resources. This puts the United States one step closer to being on the warpath, but it won't be for a couple years later when the United States intercepts a telegram from the Germans trying to work with the Mexican government to create a conflict with the United States to distract the United States from entry into World War I. With that, I'm going to have to stop for now, and we'll pick up tomorrow.